Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the 1001 Movies podcast. This time I'll be talking about the 1995 film Cyclo, directed by Tran Anh Hung. After discussing two Italian neorealism films in a row, it's an interesting coincidence that we come to Cyclo, a film made in and about Vietnam, but obviously inspired by some of the older European film movements. Director Tran Anh Hung and his family moved from Vietnam to France in 1975 when Tran was only 12 years old. He went on to study film at the prestigious Louis Lumiere College, where he made a short film based on a Vietnamese folktale. He quickly became arguably the most recognized name in Vietnamese film a few years later when he wrote and directed The Scent of Green Papaya, which won a small handful of international awards, including 2 at the Cannes Film Festival. The film was set in Vietnam, but was produced by the French, and Tran returned to his homeland once more with the same production team to make Cyclo, which was filmed with the approval of the local authorities. The film's title refers to the 3-wheeled pedicabs often seen in Ho Chi Minh City. The first character we are introduced to, simply called the driver throughout the film and in the credits, drives a Cyclo for a living. 18 years old, he lives with his grandfather and sisters in poverty, and all 4 members of the family work and barely eke out a living. When the driver's Cyclo is stolen, he turns to a local gang of criminals for money doing small jobs, which begin as simple acts of arson and larceny, and eventually murder. Unbeknownst to the driver, his sister is also working for the same gang as a prostitute. She falls in love with her pimp, an enigmatic man credited as the Poet, and played by Tony Leung, whom we last saw in Chungking Express back in episode 2. The lives of these characters inevitably lead to a tragic and, afterwards, a somewhat peaceful conclusion. Hung paints Ho Chi Minh City the way Martin Scorsese paints New York. There is little glamour here, and almost every scene is occupied by the background noises of honking horns and yelling in the street, punctuated occasionally by birdsong or crickets. Having lived most of his life in France, I do not get the impression that Hung was proud or impressed by his home country, as few places in this film appear to have been cleaned in recent years. Ho Chi Minh is a dim, noisy, olive-green metropolis, and even the indoor electricity poses a somewhat humorous threat. Nevertheless, there are splashes of color there, such as the blue and yellow paint used by the boss madam's mentally challenged son. Near the film's conclusion, this subplot evolves into a tragedy when the boy is hit by a truck and he is covered not with bright paint, but with his own blood. The Poet, the character linking the driver and his sister to their introduction into the underworld, skulks about unhappily, a cigarette always dangling from his mouth. In one scene, he recites an internal soliloquy about his life growing up, and we are shown images of poor children that take us out of the narrative. No doubt using the techniques learned from watching films from many of the French New Wave masters, Hung's shots are lengthy and deliberately framed, not unlike the last film we discussed, La Aventura. Cyclo is not, however, truly a neo-realistic film. It borrows heavily from older films, but Hung added quick cuts of close-up shots that are jarring and eerily organic. In one scene, the driver and his criminal colleagues intend to smuggle drugs inside the carcass of a dead pig, and after they're done surgically inserting the contraband beneath the animal's skin, there is a quick shot of the pig's skin pulsing, as though it was still alive. The shot looks organic, and as we know that the beast is obviously dead, it creates discomfort in the viewer in an atmosphere that is otherwise quiet and sterile. The threat is compounded moments later when the driver is almost caught by a pair of policemen. There are other jarring moments in the film, one involving the driver being force-fed water and gasoline through a funnel and is vomiting as a result, the death of a goldfish in the same scene, and finally the tensest on-screen murder of a victim by a crime boss since Quentin Tarantino wrote True Romance a couple years earlier. The story is told in a chronological order, but still in a very non-linear fashion. Some characters enter the story with little or no introduction, and it takes intuition on behalf of the audience to understand what is truly going on. For instance, is the madam who rents the driver his Cyclo the same person who later arranges for it to be stolen, forcing him into servitude for her and her gangster underlings? The answer is not obvious at first, but as the story transpires, it's implied that there are other forces working against the driver. Does the poet know that the prostitute he is in love with and the driver whom he has employed are siblings? This is also ambiguous, but by the end of the story, it hardly matters. What did I think of it? Cyclo is, to my knowledge, the first Vietnamese film I've seen. Yes, I realize it is technically a French film, but it's set in Vietnam, the characters are all Vietnamese, and they are all speaking Vietnamese. I've been to the tourist spots of Ho Chi Minh City, and although this could hardly provide me with a real window into the country, I do get the impression that Hung had no intention to paint his homeland in a favorable light. Almost half an hour to 45 minutes could be cut from this film with no change to the narrative, but I wasn't really engrossed by the narrative anyway. This is another movie that is clearly about the director's vision, and the third consecutive film we've watched for this podcast that I couldn't really recommend to a casual moviegoer who's interested in watching a riveting story, but once again, it's visually fascinating, albeit just a little bit gross in some scenes. And as a personal aside, I can watch almost any graphic horror film, but when it comes to spurting jugular veins, and I mean realistic spurting, not like the kind in Kill Bill, I get unbelievably comfortable, almost to the point of becoming lightheaded. Cyclo has a scene just like this. Well, that's pretty much all I have to say about Cyclo. So tune in next time when we talk about Otto Preminger's 1955 The Man with the Golden Arm, starring Frank Sinatra. Also, feel free to email me with questions or comments at 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com and follow me on Twitter at 1001moviespc. And if you're enjoying our journey through film, by all means, leave a positive review for the podcast on iTunes.